There's a strange moment most people never talk about. It doesn't happen when you get a promotion. It doesn't happen when your salary crosses a certain number. And it definitely doesn't happen when you finally feel rich. It happens quietly. One day you open your banking app, and instead of that familiar tension in your chest, something feels stable. Not exciting, not rich, just stable enough that your mind doesn't immediately start calculating disasters. No panic math, no mental juggling of bills, no silent negotiation with yourself about what you can delay. And the wild part is, this moment doesn't require six figures or even close. There's a financial point that quietly changes how you experience money long before you ever consider yourself wealthy, and almost nobody recognizes it while it's happening. That point sits around $20,000. Not magic, not luck, just a threshold where your relationship with money starts behaving differently. And once you understand why, you stop seeing money as just income and start seeing it as momentum. Let's start somewhere familiar. Picture two people, same age, similar job, similar income. One of them is constantly stressed. Every bill feels like a hit. Every unexpected expense creates panic. The other is still careful, still budgeting. The difference isn't income. It's not intelligence. It's not even spending habits at first glance. It's buffer. One of them has built a cushion big enough that life surprises don't immediately throw them off balance, and that cushion quietly changes everything about how they think, decide, and act. Most people assume financial change happens in big leaps, winning money, starting a business, sudden breakthroughs. But real change usually comes from invisible thresholds, points where your behavior updates because your environment feels different. And the first major threshold most people ever encounter is that early safety buffer, around $20,000 for many lifestyles. Before that point, money feels like something you constantly defend. After that point, it starts feeling like something you can actually direct. Here's a way to understand it that makes it obvious. Imagine you're trying to breathe underwater with a small oxygen tank. At first, you're watching every second. You're anxious. You move carefully because every mistake costs air. Now imagine someone gives you a much larger tank. Same ocean, same situation, but suddenly your movements change. You stop rushing, you stop panicking, you start thinking ahead instead of just reacting. Nothing about the water changed, only your breathing room did. That's what financial breathing room does to your brain. Because when people have very little saved, the mind shifts into a survival pattern. It becomes reactive, short-term focused. Every decision gets filtered through urgency. Can I afford this right now? Or what happens if something goes wrong this month? And when your brain is stuck in that mode, it doesn't matter how ambitious you are, you're not thinking strategically, you're managing pressure. That's why people can earn decent money and still feel stuck. Their income is going in, but their mental state never leaves urgency mode long enough to plan anything beyond the immediate future. But something interesting happens when a cushion begins to form. Not a huge fortune, just enough that emergencies stop being catastrophic. Doctor's visit? Manageable. Car issue? Inconvenient, not terrifying. A slow month? Uncomfortable, but not a crisis. This is where the shift begins, because your mind stops treating every fluctuation like danger. And once the brain stops perceiving constant threat, it naturally starts looking for improvement instead of survival. That's the real hidden function of that 20,000 range. It doesn't just sit in your account, it changes the way your brain interprets. Psychologists have observed this in financial behavior studies. Even small amounts of emergency savings significantly improve perceived well-being. Not because the money solves everything, but because it reduces the feeling of constant vulnerability. And once vulnerability drops, decision-making expands. Instead of asking, how do I survive the next 2 weeks, your thinking gradually shifts toward, how do I make this situation better over time? That shift sounds small. It isn't, because survival thinking and growth thinking do not lead to the same life. Now let's talk about how people actually reach that point. For most, it doesn't happen through one big deposit. It happens through repetition, small monthly contributions, consistency, and time. Imagine someone putting aside a fixed amount every month, building slowly and earning modest investment growth along the way. At first, progress feels painfully slow. The first few thousand take effort and discipline. That's the hardest phase, not because the math is difficult, but because nothing feels like it's accelerating yet. It's like pushing a heavy object that barely moves. You put in effort, but momentum hasn't kicked in. And this is where most people quit, because early progress doesn't feel rewarding. But if they continue long enough to reach that 20,000 range, something subtle starts happening. Their money begins to participate in the process. It's also what already exists generating returns, even if small at first. The change is not dramatic, it's incremental, but it marks the beginning of a shift from pure effort to combined effort plus compounding. Think of it like rolling a small snowball down a hill. At first, you're doing all the work, but as it moves, it gathers more snow on its own. Your effort stays the same, but the outcome slowly starts increasing. And here's the key detail people miss. The timeline to reach each additional milestone starts shrinking. The first 20,000 might take a long stretch of consistent saving. The next 20,000 often takes less time, not because you suddenly earn more, but because your existing money is now contributing alongside you. And over time, this creates a pattern where the system begins to carry more weight than your individual effort. That's the beginning of financial leverage. Now let's shift to something most people don't expect. Once someone crosses that early buffer stage, their behavior around money starts to change in ways they don't immediately notice. Small decisions lose emotional intensity. Buying something inexpensive no longer triggers as much internal debate. Unexpected expenses don't derail the entire week. But more importantly, their attention shifts upward. Instead of obsessing over tiny savings decisions like whether to cut a small subscription, they start thinking about bigger levers: income growth, career moves, skill development, or investment strategy. This is one of the most important hidden effects of financial breathing room. It reduces mental noise. Because when every small expense feels urgent, your attention gets fragmented. But when small things stop feeling threatening, your mind finally has space to focus on decisions that actually change your trajectory. And this is where career dynamics begin to shift too. When someone has no savings, their job becomes a dependency relationship. Leaving feels dangerous, speaking up feels risky, negotiation feels impossible. Not because they lack confidence, but because the consequences of instability feel too high. But once there's a cushion, even a modest one, something changes internally. They stop operating from fear of loss and start operating from choice. And choice is powerful. Because when you're not desperate to keep any single situation, you naturally communicate differently. You ask for better conditions, you take more initiative, you consider opportunities you would have previously ignored. Ironically, people often don't even need to use their savings for this effect to appear. The awareness that they could leave changes how they behave and that behavioral shift is often noticed by others, leading to better roles, more trust, and sometimes increased income. So the money isn't just sitting there as protection, it's influencing identity. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Once people start feeling stable, they often begin to misinterpret what that stability is for. A common pattern appears. After reaching their first meaningful buffer, they treat it like a reward, something they've earned, and then they spend it. Upgrade lifestyle, buy something emotional, make a large purchase they previously delayed. And in that moment, they unknowingly reset the very thing that created their stability. because that buffer wasn't the finish line, it was the engine start. Another mistake shows up in a different form: lifestyle expansion. As soon as breathing room appears, expenses quietly grow to match it. Slightly better living situations, slightly more convenience, slightly more consumption. And over time, the buffer never truly stabilizes because it's constantly being absorbed. Meanwhile, the people who benefit long-term from reaching that point do something different. They protect it. Not forever, not rigidly, but long enough for compounding and habits to fully establish themselves. Because what they eventually realize is this: the real value of that first financial cushion is not the money itself, it's what it trains you to become. Someone who can delay gratification, someone who can stay consistent over time, someone who can build. That identity is what creates long-term wealth, not the specific number in the account. Now let's address something people often misunderstand about money growth. They assume wealth comes from finding special opportunities, exclusive investments, insider access, secret strategies. But for most people, building wealth steadily, the foundation is much simpler: time plus consistency plus basic investing principles. The real difference isn't access, it's scale. When your savings are small, returns feel irrelevant. A small percentage doesn't move your life much. But when your savings grow, the same percentage begins to produce meaningful results. And that's when money starts generating noticeable support instead of invisible background growth. Eventually, you reach a point where your investments begin contributing real monthly or yearly value without additional effort from you. And that's when the psychological relationship with money changes again. Because now, part of your progress is coming from your past decisions, not just your current effort. And that creates a powerful loop. Stability leads to better decisions lead to growth, and growth increases stability. A reinforcing cycle instead of a constant struggle. So what does all of this actually mean? It means the first major financial goal most people should focus on isn't luxury, status, or even long-term wealth. It's reaching the point where life stops feeling financially fragile. Because once you remove fragility, everything else becomes easier to build. Your career decisions improve, your stress levels decrease, your planning becomes clearer, your opportunities expand, and your money begins working with you instead of just passing through you. $20,000 isn't a destination, it's a transition point, a shift from reacting to life financially to directing it. And once you experience that shift, it becomes very hard to go back to the old way of thinking, because you finally understand something important. Money isn't just about what you have, it's about what your mind is free to do when you're not worried about losing it. And this is where everything starts to quietly lock into place in a different way. Because once your mind stops being dominated by urgency, you begin noticing something you didn't have space to see before: patterns. You start realizing how much of your past financial stress wasn't actually about money itself, but about timing, lack of preparation, and constant pressure stacking up on top of it. When you're always reacting, life feels random, one problem after another, one setback after another. But when there's even a small buffer, you start to see that many of those emergencies were just normal life events hitting an unprepared system. That realization alone changes how you plan the future. You stop expecting perfection. You start expecting variability and preparing for it. And that's a completely different mindset. Because now, instead of trying to avoid every financial hit, you begin building resilience against them. You don't fear instability as much. You design around it. And that shift is subtle but powerful. For example, before reaching this stage, most people treat money like something fragile. One mistake feels like everything is collapsing. One unexpected expense feels like going backward. But after building even a modest cushion, mistakes stopped feeling like disasters. They start feeling like feedback. That changes how you learn. It changes how you grow. It even changes how willing you are to try new things because failure no longer carries the same emotional weight. And this is where real progress begins to accelerate, not because life becomes easier, but because you become more adaptable inside it.